Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. As much as I hated the small town that was Forks, Washington, I knew this was the right decision to make. The cold didn't matter anymore, and it was getting harder and harder to hide the results of my missing time from my mother, who was far too perceptive when she was actually paying attention. She nearly had a breakdown when I disappeared, and I hated leaving so soon after, but hiding the results of my transformation in Phoenix was becoming impossible. There were only so many sick days that I could take from school when the sun was out in Phoenix, and she was starting to obsess over me being sick so much. I'd never been a rebellious teenager, and blaming her marriage to Phil for my decision to run away, then move away, was not a lie I expected her to believe for long. Thank goodness she was too worried about me to ponder too much that my lie really wasn't a logical one. But it also gave me a good reason to get her to agree that my moving to Forks and living with Charlie was really in my best interests. I really didn't have any problems with Phil, but unfortunately for him, he was the easiest scapegoat in this entire fiasco. Actually, Phil was great for my mom. He loved her impetuous and unpredictable ways, and she adored him right back. I didn't have to worry about leaving her so long, as Phil was there to make sure there was gas in her car and food in the cupboards. So, here I was, on a plane to Port Angeles, glad that I was able to schedule the flight during a day where there wasn't a whole lot of sun in Phoenix. The plane ride? That was a whole new experience in torture. Being stuffed into tight quarters with delicious-smelling people nearly in my lap was testing the limits of my self-control. It was easier to control this desperate need for blood when it was my darling, erratic mother. I had an aversion to dealing with even the thought of hurting my mother, but crowds of harried airline travelers were so much easier to want dead. It was much harder not to bite people who irritated me, tried to shove me, and constantly got into my personal space. However, I was determined. I was not like the thing that had made me into this. It was one of the things I wondered about over and over, why he had left me alive. I should have died out in the desert that night, and I had no idea why I had instead been left to burn, to return home to my mother with this horrible need for blood. I had found, however, that the need could be tempered. I did not have to be the monster that my attacker was. It never really went away. The burning in my throat didn't stop. But I could resist the draw so long as I was stuffed full of animal blood. Any rabbits, foxes, and coyotes which had been in danger of overpopulation had been dealt with for a little while in the Arizona deserts, thanks to me. It wasn't all that tasty, but it made sure that there wasn't a trail of drained people in my wake. Last night, I'd snuck out of the house and made one last foray into the desert, making sure that I was not only full but overfed, trying to deal with the long flight the best way I could. As the plane taxied into the gate, I waited impatiently for everyone to disembark, not wanting to draw attention to myself if I rushed out. Instead, I sat quietly and held my breath. Keeping my eyes downcast, I made my way to the nearest restroom to check my eyes. One factor of my change was difficult to disguise. My eyes had turned a bright crimson red, while contacts were a solution. They dissolved within the space of hours. This made it very difficult to hide the unnatural color. Black contacts took my eyes to a rather muddy brown color. This was not close, what they were before, but dark enough that I didn't stand out as being non-human. Lucky for me, the next obvious change wasn't so obvious. My skin had been almost vampire pale before the attack, and a bit of light makeup over my face and neck kept my mother from being too suspicious. The makeup didn't help at all in the sun. I glittered like a socialite's jewels, but it did help give a little more color to my skin. My father was unobservant enough that I was hoping the contacts were the only thing I was going to have to use to disguise myself. But the contacts were very expensive, considering how often I had to replace them. High school students didn't make a lot in the first place, and I'd had to quit my job after the attack, unsure of my control. My savings had taken a sizable dent for the sake of ugly mud-brown eyes. As I stood in front of the mirror, I quickly glanced into my eyes, too fast for anyone around me to see, and saw that my contacts had melted away. I could tell when my vision wasn't obscured by the thin plastic, but I tried to not replace them until they were completely gone. I reached into my bag and pulled out another set of contacts. No sense in scaring Charlie, who was sure to be waiting for me in the police cruiser in the loading zone outside. They felt like a huge chunk of plastic wedged in my eyes when I put the contacts back in, and it took me a few seconds to become resigned to them. There was no way I was going to become used to them, but resigned was acceptable at least. Now that I looked somewhat human again, I headed out of the restroom and into the baggage claim to pick up my one suitcase. I tried to walk at a human pace out to the curb, where I knew Charlie was waiting. I was not looking forward to the drive to Forks stuffed into a car with my father. This trip to live with Charlie tested my self-control in ways that I had tried to plan for, but when it came down to it, was nearly impossible to do so. You can be prepared and feel like you are ready to sit surrounded by delicious-smelling people for hours on end, but it doesn't quite compare to the torment of the reality. I needed to hunt again. It would have to be tonight, and thankfully Charlie's house was bordering the forest, and I would be able to escape easily. Another one of my reasons to move here. I was sure there was more game, but also a greater variety. Desert coyotes were tastier than hare. They were not nearly as prolific, but they were larger. I was looking forward to the thought of larger animals here where there was plenty of land for them. As I'd thought, the long drive to Forks with Charlie was interminable. Thankfully, Charlie wasn't a talker like Renee, and most of the ride was made in silence. I tried not to breathe. At all. Instead, I concentrated on fidgeting. I had found pretty quickly. When I'd returned home that people moved a lot. Their bodies were so soft and weak that any position was uncomfortable to keep for very long. And that meant a lot of shifting. Movement that my body didn't need anymore. I could hold the same position perfectly for hours on end. Noticing this, I'd watched Renee and Phil as I realized that no part of me reacted to anything the way that it did when I was, well, human. It was hard to think about, hard to consider. I probably couldn't consider myself human any longer. So I've focused most of my attention on moving, making my chest go up and down, as though inflating and deflating with breath, blinking several times a minute. Though this shifted the contacts on my eyes uncomfortably, shifting the weight of my body in the seat, and crossing and uncrossing my ankles repeatedly. It wasn't perfect, but it was distracting at least. By the time we arrived at the house in Forks, I was desperate for fresh air. I found it so very difficult to be trapped in the car with my father, but I was not going to be the cause of his death. I controlled myself for weeks with Phil and Renee, and I was even able to attend school fairly regularly on overcast days without anyone getting hurt, so I knew that I could do it. It took supreme effort to step slowly out of the squad car, and I took in a deep, bracing breath of fresh air as I did. I stood there a moment, inhaling slowly before I turned carefully and went to get my suitcase from the trunk. Charlie was already there, of course, insisting on carrying it himself, though I could easily pick up his car and carry it into the house. But I didn't want him to know that, so I just smiled and followed him into the house. I hadn't been here in years, forcing my father to take time off in the summer. I insisted that we go other places, warm places. Looking back, it seemed very childish of me to have refused to come here, especially since temperature as a whole mattered to me so little anymore. Charlie led the way upstairs, and I glided after him, holding my breath again as we made our way to my old room. It had always been my room since my birth, and I thought it was amusing he felt that he needed to escort me up. "Well, here's your room," he said, as he opened the door for me and set my suitcase on the bed. "I tried to update it a little for you, since you were a kid the last time you stayed here. Put in the computer your mother insisted on, and got a new bed. You do like blue, right?" He gestured to the sheet, set and comforter, covering the new bed, and I smiled. "Yeah, Dad, blue is fine, thanks." He'd gone to a lot of effort to get things ready for me to come and stay here. It looked like he was more excited about this than I thought. Charlie, he'd always had a hard time expressing himself, but the effort he took in making sure I had a comfortable space said a lot about how much he cared. "Well, I'll leave you to settle in," Charlie continued as he made his way awkwardly to the door. "Let me know if you, need anything. There's a game on tonight I thought I'd watch." "My dad in sports." He'd be camped out in front of the TV the rest of the night. "Sure, Dad. Thanks again. I'll just work on unpacking." I assured him that I'd be just fine while he obsessed about the game. Just like that, he was gone. Door closed behind him, and he was on his way to get a beer before he found his way to his favorite armchair for the rest of the night. I could hear him rustling around downstairs before the blare of the TV came on, and I knew his attention was captured. I tried to move slowly as I worked at unpacking my suitcase, sure that Charlie would not pop in suddenly, but still, it was less to hide. I'd found that with Renee it was just easier to continue to do things as I had always done them, moving at a human pace. It still didn't take long to put all my clothes away in the dresser in the small closet. I hadn't brought much with me. Honestly, I didn't have many cold weather clothes and I'd have to go shopping soon to keep up the illusion of being human in the cold. I looked around when I was done, going over in my mind the things I needed to do, and then reached over to turn on the computer to drop my mom an email. She'd become particularly obsessive about where I was since the time I'd been missing, and she'd want to make sure that I got into town all right, and that I was safe with Charlie. Sending her an email sooner rather than later was easier than dealing with the demanding phone call I was sure to get if I didn't. The email didn't take long, and I shut off the computer again and settled back onto the bed, leaning against the wall with several of my favorite books at hand. Jane Austen was always a favorite, as were the Bronte sisters. I also had a serious weakness for the poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She lived a real-life love story, and it reflected so beautifully in her words that I couldn't help but devour them. I set the other books aside and opened my favorite of her collection, Sonnets from the Portuguese. Mostly they were about her love for her husband, but there was a line at the end of one of them that described so well how I had felt since I regained control of myself after the change. Of desolation, there's a voice within that weeps, as thou must sing, alone, aloof. This was my life now. I would always be apart from everyone else, alone, aloof, desolation. I dropped the book beside me on the bed and tilted my head to look out the window, watching the ever-present rain mist up the air and cloud the sky. The rain set off my mood quite well, covering the town, and me in darkness. The weekend with Charlie was really long, so I actually looked forward to going to school Monday morning. He bought me a truck from Billy Black, a friend of his in La Push, so now I had human transportation. I loved the truck. It was an old classic, and despite it being loud, it was awesome to not have to worry about Charlie dragging me everywhere in his patrol car. As I pulled away from the house, wincing internally at the noise the truck made, I smiled to myself. I cooked for Charlie all weekend, and it became obvious that left to his own devices, his nutrition was seriously lacking. The man lived on pizza delivery, even though he had an entire freezer on the back porch filled with fish. Charlie was insane for fishing, but it seemed that cooking it for himself was something that was almost beyond him. I offered to take over the kitchen, and he was relieved, more than grateful, scarfing down the simple meals I made with the meager offerings of his kitchen. I planned on stopping at the market to pick up some groceries on the way home from school. If I was going to be feeding my father, he was going to eat things that were good for him. I felt like it was least that I could do to take care of him, to thank him for taking me in when I needed it so desperately. I was deliberately early to school, wanting to get into the office and get my schedule before everyone started to arrive. I needed to explore the campus a little, learn where everything was, getting used to the smell of humans before I was surrounded by their delicious scents. It also wouldn't hurt to have a few escape routes worked out in case I needed to get some fresh air fast. I parked in the staff parking lot and made my way into the office, walking up to the desk where a redhead woman was staffing the office. I cleared my throat to get her attention. She turned and looked at me, and I could see her eyes widening and my smile faded as I introduced myself. "I'm Bella Swan," I said softly, and I could see the recognition in her eyes. "This is my first day. My father said that I should already be enrolled." "Oh, of course. I misspoke. In fact, I have your schedule right here. We were expecting you this morning." She offered the papers across the desk toward me, smiling in welcome. "The one on the top is your schedule. You need to have all your teachers sign the next one, indicating that you've checked in with them. The one on the bottom is a map of the campus so you don't get lost." Miss Cope instructed me as she looked at me again, confusion in her eyes. I noticed that humans often had that reaction to me now. They weren't sure that it was safe to be around me. They were right, it wasn't safe to be anywhere near me. I took my schedule and smiled at her as I thanked her. I made some effort to try to look as non-threatening as possible and turned to go. I deliberately tripped over the non-existent threshold as I walked out the door, wanting to seem as frail and clumsy as I was in my human life. That seemed to help things somewhat in Phoenix. Heading back out to my truck, I started it up again to move it into the student lot and took a moment to look down at my schedule. I memorized it instantly, one of the new benefits of my altered self. I never worried about forgetting anything. It looked like English was first, and I frowned. The first thing I wanted to get my hands on was the book list. I hoped they had a more diverse reading requirement than the one at my prior school. I hated the thought of being forced into reading Mark Twain. His most popular works were acceptable to almost everyone. I just didn't like reading them. To me, he was a dirty old man. I was hoping that if they put me through that again, I could avoiding the reread and recycle my essays from Phoenix. It wasn't cheating since I had already done the work, I hopped out of my truck and I realized I was being far too graceful. I let my shoes catch on the asphalt as I walked toward the building I knew held the English department from the map, memorized at a glance. After a moment I realized not only was everyone looking at me, but also at the pace I was walking. I probably didn't seem entirely human. The thought made me hesitate, and as I deliberately stumbled over a crack in the black top of the parking lot, I caught a scent that made me stop entirely. It was somewhat familiar, and yet not. I wasn't used to running into things that smelled completely new, and this one had me totally baffled. It was sweet, not delicious like the people around me, and I was taken aback. I hated being the center of attention, and it was distracting me. I had to figure out what that scent was. I had no idea if it was something I should be worried about. As I entered the classroom, I hung my coat on the pegs with everyone else's, then turned to assess the classroom. It seemed standard for Forks, with a small anteroom right at the entry where outdoor things could be left before opening up into the larger portion. I went directly to the teacher to get my form signed and then picked a seat in the back where it wouldn't be so easy for everyone to constantly watch the new girl. I could see them from the corner of my eye, the other students. They were staring at me. Great. I was now center stage. I could hear the whispering across the room easily. One of the boys sat down next to me and I turned my head to look at him. I tried to look surprised to see him there, even though I easily heard him tell his friends that he was going to join me. "Hi, I'm Mike Newton," he said with a broad smile, obviously trying to flirt. "Bella Swan," I offered back reluctantly. I had no idea how I was going to fit in with these children, but for my parents' sake I had to try. I just didn't feel like one of them anymore. "Ah, the chief's daughter," Mike stated, as though everyone in the school didn't already know exactly who I was. I gave him a slight, toothless smile in response, as though impressed by his remarkable abilities at deduction. Thankfully, the teacher called the class to order, and I didn't have to try to make nice anymore. The next classes were government, trigonometry, and Spanish. They were much the same. I was amused by the friendly and mostly well-meaning students who walked up and introduced themselves. I actually met a few people that I was going to make an effort to try and befriend. Throughout the morning, however, I kept catching hints of the scent I noticed in the parking lot. It wasn't always the same. In fact, there were 5 distinctive variances of it, and it only served to make me more concerned. By the time lunch hit, I was becoming tired of the human charade and the human males who were far too eager to make sure I knew who they were. I walked into the cafeteria with Jessica Stanley, a vivacious girl who wanted to make sure everyone saw her making nice with the new girl. I agreed to sit with her and her friends. It was better than sitting alone and drawing even more attention to myself. I found soon after my transformation, my body didn't absorb human food and I needed to choke it up later. Still, it was easier than dealing with Renee or Charlie getting all suspicious about why I wasn't eating. It was evident to me, making some effort at consuming human food was necessary for the deception. I limited myself to a lemonade today, though not up to the extreme of eating cafeteria food. That stuff was barely palatable when I was human, and was only more disgusting now. I knew I was on edge already, and figured that solid lumps of greasy pizza sitting uncomfortably in my stomach would not make things any easier. I tripped over the table leg as I sat down and tried to make it look like I barely caught myself as I dropped into the chair. I noticed without a thought the students who joined us. Mike Newton was here, along with a couple of the other boys that made sure to introduce themselves to me. Eric Yorkie and Tyler Crowley. Several girls joined us, including Angela Weber and Lauren Mallory. Angela I liked. She seemed so sweet and uncomplicated and genuinely welcoming when I met her in one of my earlier classes. Lauren glared at me openly. I thought she probably didn't appreciate all the attention I was getting from the boys. I would have loved to tell her that she was welcome to them, but figured that probably wasn't the best way to blend in with the human teenager persona I was working for. There was a flurry of talking as everyone recapped their weekend, the assignments they were working on, upcoming tests. There was a spring dance everyone was excited about. And that seemed to be the major discussion for the girls. It was a girls' choice dance, and all but Angela seemed more worried about what to wear rather than whom to ask. The boys kept nudging each other and looking at me, speculating in their own way on the dance. The main whispering was about who they thought I would ask. Well, wouldn't it surprise them all if they knew I had no intention of going? I was a menace of a klutz as a human, and I saw no reason to act as though I was anything else now. Hence the deliberate tripping. It was easier for everyone if I tried to be the human I used to be, as much as possible. Avoiding dances had been my way of protecting the other students, and I was happy to continue that illusion, though my reasons were different now. Jessica was in the middle of catching me up on the local girls' choice traditions for dance invitations as the cafeteria door opened and another group of students entered. I was assailed by the same fragrances that concerned me earlier, but now those scents were fresh. I now knew the explanation for the differences I noticed. There were 5 of these students, and therefore 5 unique versions of the scent. My eyes widened and I dropped my head. I hid my reaction behind the curtain of my hair. I left down today just for this purpose, hiding when I wanted no one to see my face. "Who are they?" I whispered to Jessica softly, my head tilting toward the other students as they entered the lunch line and grabbed trays. My eyes took in the clues. So obvious to my new eyes. They were no more human than I. "Oh, that's the Cullens," Jessica answered, finally grateful that I was looking to her for the local gossip. They stood out so much that no one at the table seemed surprised by my curiosity. The Dr. Cullen's children. Some of them are actually adopted, but the 2 blonde ones, they're twins, they're just foster kids. Jessica added with the air of someone imparting something particularly juicy. She leaned toward me, the scent of her blood wafting right into my face and causing me to stiffen in pain from the burning. "The big one, Emmett. He's with the blonde, Rosie," Jessica gestured with her hands, trying to be discreet, but she might as well be waving huge colored flags in the air. "The little black-haired one, Alice, she's with Jasper. The tall blonde guy, the one who always looks like he's eaten something sour." Jessica was more than delighted to offer this apparently scandalous tidbit, as her eyes twinkled in malicious delight. "I can't believe their parents allow it. They all live in the same house. You know, like siblings. It's kind of gross if you think about it," Jessica added with the fervent tone of someone willing to take anyone else down for her own benefit. I was amused by the logic of her human teenage mind. Jessica was sure they were sleeping together. I glanced over at the 4 she described and the way they interacted with each other. I couldn't hold back a small smile. Jessica was probably right, at least about the big guy and the blonde bombshell. My eyes moved over the Cullen family again, as I pushed my hair out of my eyes. As I glanced at the 5th Cullen, I focused on the one that didn't seem to be attached at the hip to one of the women. My eyes stopped there and I couldn't bring myself to look away. I was held in place suddenly as his head turned and his eyes met mine. Elizabeth Browning's words came to me again. The face of all the world has changed, I think. Since first I heard the footsteps of thy soul. What about the other one? I shook off the strange feeling as I turned to look at Jessica. I was surprised at how much I needed to hear her answer. "Oh, him. That's Edward Cullen. He's too good for any of the girls in this school," Jessica replied haughtily. I wondered when he shot her down. There was an edge of anger to her voice that didn't surprise me as much as amuse me. I had to work to not let any amusement show on my face at Jessica's disdain. I was distracted enough that I lifted my head and glanced back at the table where the Cullens gathered. My eyes skimmed over the couples and stopped at the younger-looking one, the one Jessica identified as Edward. My eyes met his once again. I saw him as clearly across the room as if he were standing right in front of me. Suddenly, the color of his eyes struck me. They were a warm, rich, liquid brown, the color of honey, creamy and welcoming. My eyes widened in surprise, and I focused in closer on his amazing eyes, looking for the line where the contact lens should be. The one that hid crimson irises from the masses. I couldn't find it. Where I had been initially fascinated, now I was confused and I looked away quickly. My fascination turned to fright as the reality of the situation struck me hard. There were vampires in Forks and I found them. The last vampire I met killed me, and I couldn't be sure these 5 wouldn't do their best to finish the job. I wasn't sure if I wasn't going to be dead for real very soon. I deliberately lifted the bottle, drinking some of the lemonade in front of me. It took me some effort to consume the half of the bottle I already drank, and I was grateful as the bell rang. Everyone at my table stood and gathered their things to go to class. I fell into step with Mike since he was in my next class and offered to show me the way. As I rose, I tilted my head to the side, trying to observe the table where the Cullens were sitting without being obvious about it. I noticed that Edward was still watching me, Alice's hand on his arm. His head was tilted slightly toward her as though he were listening to her say something to him. I grew more confused. It was an odd posture since she hadn't said anything aloud. As I walked into the biology classroom, I left Mike and went right to the front to have the teacher sign my form. My mind kept looping over the same sentence over and over and over again. There were vampires in Forks and I found them. I wasn't sure how to hide from them. Especially as we were attending the same school, I was desperately confused. Why would vampires, other than me, torture themselves by attending high school. Never mind the fact that high school itself is torture. The burning thirst was leaps and bounds worse than that. What would make the burning worth it? Mostly, I wanted to know how they hid their eyes without the contacts I relied upon. The biology teacher, Mr. Banner, signed my form and gestured me toward an empty table near the back as he handed me a book. My lab partner wasn't here yet, but I hardly took notice. The fan in the front next to the teacher's desk was blowing the scent of fresh human blood over me repeatedly, making the burn in my throat consuming. I sat down, gathering my notebook and a pen from my backpack, ready to take notes like everyone else. It must appear as though I have a horrible and imperfect memory, I reminded myself as I opened my notebook. I took comfort in the moment, the familiar actions of the human charade. I felt my lab partner sit down as the fan turned to blow on the other half of the room. The scent of one of the vampires hit me fresh and hard, and I looked up in utter shock as Edward Cullen sat down next to me, his eyes meeting mine. "Hello," he said in that softly musical voice that was so very similar to the one that I heard from myself, though his voice was deep and rich. I barely contained a shiver of delight at the sound of it. "I'm Edward Cullen," he continued in a formal tone. I stared at him, not sure how I should respond to him. I didn't really expect him to attack me in the middle of class, but I didn't know if he wasn't just waiting until afterward. After school, perhaps. "Bella Swan," I responded after a moment, my voice husky with my uncertainty, and frankly fear. Mr. Banner stood just then, calling the class to order, and the fan turned again. It was blowing right on me, and I stiffened, holding my breath. The teacher was standing right in front of the fan, blowing the concentrated smell of his blood directly toward me. I looked away from Edward in an effort to bolster my control. "The chief's daughter," Edward said after the fan turned away again. He had been quiet during the most difficult moments for me, and his voice was full of surprise when he spoke again. My eyes darted to him again quickly. I gave him a short nod, afraid to speak as the bloodlust was still flooding my mind. "You're Chief Swan's daughter?" Edward asked again. His voice was soft, deliberately not drawing the attention of the teacher, as his eyes took in the things that humans didn't see or didn't want to see. The too pale to be human skin, the hint of red under the obvious line of dark contacts, the inhuman grace hidden by feigned clumsiness. "Yes," I answered as I found my voice again, my control strengthened for the moment. I returned his look with mock boldness. His eyes met mine, and the look in them hardened perceptibly. I could see his eyes take in the amount the contacts had faded just in the time we were talking. His vampire eyes would be able to discern the slight difference in shading. Then his voice dropped, too softly for humans to hear. "How old are you, Bella Swan?" His voice was stiff and on the edge of threatening. I took in another deep breath. A stress reaction. I was now struggling with the urge to race from the room at inhuman speed and disappear again. I realized that Forks was no longer safe for me. My sanctuary, my last chance at living a human life, was gone. I couldn't answer. I had no idea why he wanted to know how old I was. Wasn't it obvious? I was in high school, for heaven's sake. "How old are you?" he repeated once more as his hand shot out. He grabbed onto my upper arm as I shifted my weight in preparation to flee, if it was necessary. A shiver shot through my spine, and I became aware that it wasn't entirely fear. I felt at his touch. I thought I could pull away if I tried. He wasn't holding me that hard, but I didn't want to draw more attention to myself. I was already the center of attention. The new kid in school in a very small town, 17. I offered hesitantly, just as softly as he had. I could hear the confusion that was now obvious in my voice. I sacrificed the ability to cover my reactions as I took a stronger hold on the stronger urges, the fight or flight ones. "Are you really?" Surprise echoed in his tone as the confusion had in mine. "Yes." Did he expect me to lie? His hand tightened on my arm, and I glanced at the front of the room to see if the teacher noticed anything. He was completely oblivious, and Edward seemed to be careful about what he was doing in order to avoid notice. He hid his hold on me behind the curtain of my own hair. "How long have you been 17, Bella Swan?" he asked again, and it suddenly became obvious to me what he was asking. My eyes lifted back to Edward Cullen's gorgeous honey-colored eyes, and they were fierce, dangerous. I was too frightened not to answer. "Since my birthday last fall," I answered honestly, and then took an unnecessary bracing breath. I decided to answer the question he wanted answered, instead of the roundabout one that he actually asked. "I have been like this for 2 months," I whispered almost too softly for his enhanced hearing to hear, and far too fast for human ears, even if it were loud enough. His hand tightened on me even further, his eyes widening in surprise before he turned abruptly to the front, and his expression cleared. He suddenly looked as innocently human as I figured it was possible for him to look. "The Krebs cycle," he answered the question that Mr. Banner asked without any hesitation at all. If I were human still, I would have blushed. I had been so absorbed in our discussion that I didn't notice we'd drawn the teacher's attention, though I was quite aware of the need to not do so. The lecture continued, and Edward still didn't release me. After Mr. Banner was completely focused elsewhere again, he leaned slightly in my direction. He returned the conversation where we left off a few minutes earlier. His voice was too soft, too fast for human ears. "We're going to take this discussion out to the parking lot after class. Do not draw attention to yourself. You seem to have done well enough today, so far." Edward's voice was low and threatening. He made it clear that unless I was actually fast enough to get away, I was going to do just what he said. His hold on me made sure that I understood his meaning exactly. I nodded my agreement, and he finally let me go. My arm throbbed where I could still feel the imprint of his fingers, but as I sensed his eyes remain on me, I felt a shiver that wasn't fear slide down my spine. My outward focus was directed toward the teacher again. I tried to look like I was paying attention to the lecture, though I bit on my lower lip nervously. I could not help but stiffen when the fan blew directly in my face. Time after time, increasing the burn those seconds it was directly on me. I did not like the way I felt. The last time I was this frightened, I was bleeding out on the desert floor as my attacker and his companion raced away and laughing in delight, sure that I would shortly be dead. This feeling of fear strained against my will. Urges arose that made me want to react in ways that I was desperate to suppress. Fear wasn't the only thing I felt when his attention was focused directly on me. I admitted to myself, but it was by far overriding. I let my head drop slightly and I brushed my hair forward to hide my face from Edward's perceptive gaze. I doodled on the notebook in front of me, paying attention to the lecture in a less dominant portion of my mind. My thoughts kept going back to my parents. I arrived 3 days and I was going to have to leave again. It was that or the Cullen siblings were going to kill me. They surely weren't going to share their territory with me, even if I was careful to only drink the blood of animals. That would likely appear downright insane to them. I was going to have to disappear for real this time. Renee would lose it. Charlie would likely head up the search to find me. I didn't want to do this to my parents. They went through enough 2 months ago when I was missing after the attack. How could things possibly get worse? Biology was long, too long. Painfully long, yet I never wanted it to end. I was at the point where I hoped they wouldn't leave my dead, mangled body out in the open on school property. One of the students would find me, they'd call the station, and my dad would be right in the middle of my crime scene. Edward's hand touched my shoulder briefly, too briefly for anyone else to have seen. I felt the pressure, and I knew what it meant. It would draw too much attention if he dragged me out of the classroom, but he made it clear I was going with him, whether or not I wanted to. I let my hair fall into my face again as I gathered my things and put them in my backpack. I moved with deliberate human slowness as I rose to follow Edward, sure to grab my coat before we made our way outside. As I walked, my head remained down. I was hiding my terror behind the curtain of my hair. I was afraid that my expression would give it all away, and I couldn't afford any of these human children to see what reflected in my eyes. Not only was I sure that my fear was reflected there, but my contacts were dissolving again, and I didn't think Edward was going to let me escape into the bathroom to replace them. I wondered how much he was like the man that had taken me into the desert. Did they know each other? A glance to the side confirmed that he was still there, walking silently beside me. His face was impassive, completely expressionless. I swallowed nervously. The burning in my throat was such an ever-present thing that I felt strange when this new influx of feeling overcame the thirst, fear, nervousness, uncertainty. The fear I felt was laced with aggression, a feeling not unfamiliar but still very new. It burned like fire through my blood. Some part of me wanted to attack the cause of my fear. This part of me wanted to take him down, hurt him until I wasn't afraid anymore. I couldn't let that part of my brain take over. It was not only the personal knowledge and conviction that I was not a murderer, but there was something about Edward Cullen that made me feel that hurting him would hurt me. I followed Edward to the parking lot, stopping at a shiny silver Volvo parked near the edge of the lot. It was only several rows down from my ancient pickup. I looked up, wanting to see if my immediate death was coming, and my eyes met his again. He gasped, his fingers grabbed my chin, turning me so he could see my eyes clearly, as the last of my contacts melted away. There was no hiding them now, so bright a crimson red that no one could miss it. His grip tightened on my jaw, and I winced at the tightness. I knew it wasn't pretty, but I didn't understand the anger that reflected in his face now. "You're a newborn, just as you said," he said, as though I should know all about that. "Where is your sire, newborn?" His voice was still soft, vibrating with what I thought was anger. "My sire?" I wasn't sure what he was asking. "You mean the one that made me like this?" That was a logical leap in my opinion, and at his nod I let out a slow breath. I don't know, and I hope I never see him again. His eyes narrowed in surprise, and he turned to observe the small, dark-haired girl that I knew was his sister Alice approach us. He moved into place as though ready to defend her as she got close, and I rolled my eyes. "Edward," she greeted in an upbeat, lyrical voice that was filled with satisfaction and delight. As she turned to look at me, she squealed in outright delight and leapt on me, breaking past Edward's defense as she hugged me tightly. "Bella!" I stumbled back. She was tiny, but she packed a wallop, especially when she leapt on unsuspecting people. I nearly vibrated with the urge to throw her off me, my instinct seeing the hug as an attack. Taking deep breaths, I forced away the instinct to react violently and stared at her in surprise. Hello," I greeted her politely, but I was trying to distract her long enough for me to break her hold on me. After a moment, she dropped back to stand beside Edward, looking smug. "Alice." Edward's eyes rolled as though he were used to her antics, shaking his head slightly as he watched me. He watched me warily as though he expected me to attack at any moment. He seemed surprised when I didn't. "We're going to be great friends," Alice informed me, her tone downright gleeful. "I can see it." Her last words seemed to clear up Edward's confusion, if not mine, and his expression turned amused as he tilted his head to look down at her. He seemed distracted for a moment, and then turned to look back at me again, his eyes appraising. "She's a newborn, Alice," he informed her, though it sounded like he almost expected her to already know. "I know," she confirmed and smiled at him knowingly. "I saw her coming." Edward turned a surprised look on her again, and Alice looked even more satisfied. "Yep, I hid it from you," Alice was gleeful again, popping the paw, and I shifted to lean against the silver car. Leaning was part of my human charade, done specifically as several students passed us on their way to get something for the next class from one of the cars. "She's crazy if she thinks she's going to befriend the Cullens," I heard a hostile voice I recognized as Lauren's across the parking lot. Her tone was liberally laced with jealousy. I looked up in surprise to see Lauren talking to Jessica and turned my head away again before they could see that I had noticed them. "They don't like anyone," Jessica agreed, as the two of them walked into the door of their classroom, and I was glad the presence of the teacher in their classroom put an immediate end to their discussion. I turned my attention back to the pair before me. Lauren and Jessica's exchange made me even more nervous about them. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I was off balance, and I did not like it at all. Alice looked somewhat sympathetic, but I still wasn't sure about Edward. He'd been extremely hostile earlier. Edward watched me, Alice watched him, and he kept nodding like he was answering someone's questions. I cleared my throat after a moment, looking back at Alice before I met Edward's eyes again. "If you're going to kill me, would you please do it gently so that when my dad finds my body he doesn't freak out?" I asked softly, looking away again. I was strong, obviously a lot stronger than a human, but I didn't figure I had a chance with two older vampires. Not that I was willing to just lay down and die, I just wasn't sure I could win. "We're not going to kill you, Bella," Alice answered as though it was the silliest thing she'd ever heard. Her tone was completely matter-of-fact, as though there was nothing more absolute than that. Besides that, if we were, there wouldn't be enough left of you to find. "You're not?" I knew my surprise showed in my voice and my face as my gaze turned back on the little elfin woman, and then I gasped in shock. "Well, if you get rid of my body, my parents will never know for sure what happened to me," I protested vehemently. "We have no intention of killing you. I said we were going to be great friends, didn't I?" Alice's sure words made Edward laugh softly, and he shook his head as she continued. "But even if we were, it takes a lot to kill one of us." Edward tilted his head toward Alice, and he leaned toward me just slightly. Alice is a bit crazy, but of course we love her. She can tell the future, Bella. It's just a little quirk of hers. Alice shot him a dirty look and stuck her tongue out at him as she turned to smile at me again. And Edward can read minds, she informed me with a haughty tilt of her head. I felt cold as sudden panic flared. He can read my mind? Then why was he acting so funny in biology? Insisting on me answering his questions and then getting upset and practically dragging me out here to talk. I must have looked panicked because Alice suddenly laughed. "'Tis not yours, Bella. My dear brother has no idea what you're thinking. It's driving him nuts." Alice's bell-like giggle filled the air again, and Edward sighed, rolling his eyes at her again. She ignored Edward as she grabbed my hand. It seemed so easy for her, but I found it was impossible for me to be so unconcerned. She started to drag me back toward the school. "You have to go to your last class and get your enrollment form signed." "Wow, they made you take PE? We'll have to see if we can find a way to get you out of that. You'll have to be especially careful, but you've done an incredible job today." Alice went on and on just like there was nothing unusual going on. She completely ignored her brother's presence. "Don't worry, you'll be just fine. The teacher will let you spend the entire period up on the bleachers, so you don't have to worry about today." Edward had been following along behind us, and at Alice's words, his hand shot out to grab me again. His fingers wrapped around the same arm he'd taken a grip on earlier, and I winced. Gesh! I was starting to get sore. "She's a newborn, she can't go to PE, Alice." "Seriously, what if someone falls into her or something?" Edward was trying to drag me back toward the silver Volvo, as Alice tugged in the direction of the school. It was a good thing I was a vampire or they'd have torn me in two. "Edward, she's been doing this since she was just a few weeks old, all on her own. She's never bitten a human." Alice's glorious voice informed him in a matter-of-fact tone. "I already told you that." Edward stopped pulling on me so hard, and I sighed in relief. I started to tug my arms to get away from them. I wanted both of them to let go of me. Edward did. Alice didn't. She started dragging me toward the gym, but Edward continued to trail along behind us. "Yes, Alice, I saw that, but how?" Edward wasn't about to give up so easily. Alice stopped him at the gym doors, with a hand on his chest. "You'll have to ask her that, Edward." Alice's smile was downright mischievous. "For now, it's more important that she go to this class and not draw attention to herself." Her topaz gaze turned to me, holding me in her sight. "At least, not any more than she does just by being new in town. And she'll meet us back at your car after school so we can get this all worked out," she informed him with a tilt of her head. "Right, Bella." Her tone became pure steel, and she waited for my confirmation. I could only nod. It was the only way I was going to get free for even one class period. The silver Volvo. "All right?" Alice then looked up into my face and frowned as she noticed my eyes again. She stopped me just outside the gym door and held her hand out. I blinked at her in confusion. "Your eyes, Bella? You can't go into class like that. I'll hold your bag for you while you fix it." Alice's tone was gentle and amused. I blinked at her, glanced at Edward, and then slung my backpack off my shoulder. I had a set of contacts in the front pocket and was able to get them and toss my bag back over my shoulder without looking at Alice. I didn't know her, and my backpack held too many things that I needed to trust it with someone I didn't know. A moment later, I looked back up at her as I tossed the empty containers into a nearby trash can and gave her a moment to inspect me. It seemed to make her happy to verify that I was properly disguised. "There. Much better," she agreed, smiling and clapping her hands together delightedly. "Now, go on. We'll be waiting for you after school," she was sure to remind me. I nodded again and escaped into the gym, relieved to get away. I had survived that encounter, but no matter what Alice said, I wasn't sure that was going to last. Besides, what was that comment about it being so hard to kill one of us? I could think of some fairly horrible ways to die. I had already died once in a pretty horrible way. I certainly didn't want to die again, especially so soon after the last incident. What was it about me that attracted danger? As a human, I was plagued with life-threatening incidents, so this should not feel unusual to me. But I had never felt so tired, even as a human. I felt wrung out and stretched thin. I longed for the quiet silence of my room in Charlie's house. Instead, I went to PE. I was late to class, but I knew I would be when Edward dragged me out into the parking lot. I figured late was better than dead. I stopped just inside the door to adjust to the new contacts on my eyes. It never got more comfortable to wear them. I was surprised and not surprised when Alice was right. The teacher did let me wait out the class on the bleachers. I spent the time watching the other students play. Mike Newton was in this class with me also. and he got knocked in the head once when he was watching me more than playing the game. I hid my snicker at the idiot he was making of himself. Jessica noticed the attention I was getting from Mike, and when she didn't think I was looking, she glared at me openly. The looks got particularly dark when Mike got nailed in the head. If she thought I had given him any encouragement, she was delusional. I made it a point to appear as though I did not notice, and instead looked anywhere else. She was welcome to him. Just the thought of getting that close to a human made my throat burn so much more. Friendship was something where I could keep my distance. A boyfriend would expect to hold hands, share kisses, to go on dates in the dark like movies. Way too dangerous for me to do if that human wanted to live. The end of class came too soon for me, and I gathered up my things and made my way down the bleachers and outside while the rest of the class went to get dressed in their street clothes. No sense in sitting there driving myself nuts when I could be outside in the fresh air. Exercise made their blood that much more enticing to me. It moved actively through their veins, warming up everything that it touched. The burn increased to torment during that hour, becoming so consuming that I'd held my breath throughout the entire class. I used a stack of books, holding it up against my chest to hide the fact that it wasn't moving with breath. Before I headed to the parking lot, I had to finish the human things that were required of me today, and I hurried over to the office. I wanted to drop off the form and get back to the Volvo before they came looking for me. Ms. Cope was standing in front of her desk, talking to Edward Cullen, of all people, as I entered. I blinked in surprise at seeing him there, but stepped out of the way of another student coming in behind me. The girl dropped some papers on the desk, and then left again. I stood back by the door to wait. It wasn't polite to interrupt. "I'm sure that something can be done, Miss Cope," Edward was saying, using what must have been his most persuasive smile. "I don't know, Edward. I'll have to ask Coach Clapp and Mrs. Goff if they're willing to make the change." Miss Cope's eyes were a little unfocused, and she looked like she might start hyperventilating at any moment. He was really pouring the charm on thick, and I wondered what he was doing. I cleared my throat to let them know I was there, as their discussion seemed to have wound down, and I offered Miss Cope my signed form before turning to leave. I felt Edward beside me after he gave his farewells. He was still being charming with the office secretary, and I was a bit miffed. How could he be so friendly and nice to everyone but me? The final bell rang as we left the office, and the parking lot flooded with students on their way home. Alice was already leaning against the car when we got there. A bright smile on her face, Edward followed me like I was an unpredictable atom bomb. He expected to go off with no forewarning, taking out the entire town of Forks with me. "Right, Bella." "Edward," she greeted us, though she didn't tackle me for a hug again. Her eyes absorbed my pursed lips with a long-suffering sigh. "I know it's not easy. I agree with Edward, though. It's amazing that you are able to resist." Just then, his family approached. I knew their names from my discussion with Jessica. Jasper was the first, and he hurried over. My eyes widened as I took in the sight of him. Jasper was covered in scars, crescent-shaped bite marks, over nearly all of his visible skin. I gaped. How did any vampire feel safe around this man? I bet every vampire who gave him one of those bites was dead. Just the sight of him inspired fear on a primal level. Alice, however, leapt off the car and right into his arms with a squeal of delight. He caught her and hugged her tightly as the rest of the group came up behind him. The dark-haired vampire, the one Jessica had named Emmett, was huge. He looked just as dangerous as Jasper with all his bite marks, but Emmett looked to be raw strength. He only looked curious as he looked at me standing there. I have to admit, as dangerous as he seemed, I didn't feel as threatened as I did when my eyes strayed to Jasper. Rosie Early came to a stop next to Emmett, looking me up and down with disdain before she tilted her head at Alice and then sighed and shifted her weight on her high heels as women often do. At least, I'd noticed that most women did. I had never dared to wear anything so high off the ground. Edward looked down into my face. I couldn't help myself. I tilted my head back so that my eyes met his, and I couldn't look away. There was something that drew me toward him. It brought hope in me that this strange group of vampires really didn't intend to kill me. "I think this is a discussion best had at our house," Edward said after a long moment of just looking back at me. My control was so strong in the things I held inviolate, and I could not control myself as my vampire nature insisted that I take an involuntary step back at his suggestion. A moment later, I brought myself back under control. I had to concede that it was better than taking them to my house. At least I wouldn't be taking a bunch of unfamiliar vampires straight to my father, but I still didn't want to let them drag me off into the unknown. I vote for neutral territory, I said, a little less insistent than I'd intended. I'll ride with her, Alice suddenly threw out, mowing right over my objections. She smiled at me, ignoring any protest I made. Don't worry, Bella, this will be fun. Fun? Being dragged off into the unknown by vampires was what got me killed the last time. I'm not sure that letting you all take me wherever you want me is a good idea. I did have some sense of self-preservation, even if it was a new thing. Jasper made a noise of reluctance, looking down at Alice with open worry in his eyes. She touched his hand and then winked at him. Trust me, Alice giggled at the protest on his face and grabbed my hand again, dragging me toward my ancient truck. Edward seemed for a moment like he was going to object or stop her. Instead, he turned and climbed into the Volvo, reaching for his cell phone as he watched Alice drag me across the parking lot to my truck. They were gone before I looked back again. Alice was a fast talker, and she seemed too sure of everything. I was quite reluctant to let her drag me off, and I balked when she tried to stick me in the passenger side of my own truck. Bella, she objected as I stopped cold. I couldn't get my arm away from her. She was clamped on me like a vice. While I thought I might be able to force her little hand off me, I'd have to break things like bones, and that just made me cringe. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Bella, Alice's tone turned soothing as she stepped closer to me, shortening the distance she was pulling on my arm. I took a step back, automatically. I know what happened, Bella, she said to me softly. Most of the parking lot was empty by now, but if any humans had remained, they couldn't have hurt her. You know what happened? I wasn't sure what she was talking about. What had happened? Was this one of her visions she was trying to tell me about? Yes, when you became one of us, but you have to come with me to tell the rest of them, or they'll be totally unreasonable about the whole thing, especially Edward. She rolled her eyes with what was obviously a fond smile. He's very protective of his family, you see. She tried to explain about her brother. I knew she didn't want me to think badly of him, and really, I understood that reasoning. Alice, if you know what happened, then you know the last time vampires took me off, nothing good came of it. I tried to plead with her. There was more on this earth than I understood. I still wasn't sure about her visions, but I was willing to take it at face value until I saw a reason otherwise. I know, Bella, but we really won't hurt you, I promise. Nothing bad will happen, she gave me a grin. Her head tilted slightly. You've seen that too? I had to ask. My lips pressed together, and I sent her what I hoped was a wry look. Of course! She then nudged me back toward the truck and waited until I climbed in the passenger seat. She commandeered my keys and then jumped in beside me and started it up. Alice never stopped talking the entire way to her family's house. I could only sit quietly and listen to her as she talked about things like slumber parties and shopping trips and pedicures. I had to admit, she was darling. It was hard not to be affected by her joy in life. I'd never seen anyone get so excited about shopping trips before, not even the most girly girls in my high school in Phoenix. She was charming me, though I was still worried about my fate. I was sure that singularly, Alice's brothers were enough to tear me to pieces, but collectively, there was nowhere I could run, no place that I could hide. I was going to have to see this through for good or ill and hope for the best. I could only pray that the entire episode didn't end in tragedy for my parents. Alice turned off the road quite far out of town and onto a little dirt drive that I'd have never seen if I'd been human. The drive continued into the trees for much longer than I expected before it stopped in front of a large house. I gaped at the house, shaking my head at how lovely it was before Alice shifted to look at me and my attention was automatically captured by her. Bella, she started, and I couldn't hold back a shiver of foreboding. I know this isn't easy for you, but you don't have to worry about anything. She gave me a reassuring smile, but I could only respond to her smile with a measured look. Oh, she said suddenly, and then grinned at me. I should probably tell you that we're vegetarians too. I blinked, and she was gone, already out of my truck and waiting for me by the front fender. A moment later, she turned to face her brothers and Jasper, who came out of the house to stand on the porch. Apparently, Edward drove a whole lot faster than my ancient truck could go, and Alice had taken some time to convince me. I jumped out of the truck and met Alice where she waited for me. When I reached her, she threaded her arm through mine. Vegetarians? I questioned. I sometimes ate fish with Charlie when it was necessary, but I didn't think that was what she meant. We don't hunt humans, Bella. Alice's tone was surprised that I didn't already know this. Like you? It's why our eyes aren't red? It's from the animal blood? I stopped cold, tugging on her until she came to a stop as well. Then why are my eyes red? I was incredulous. I had to know. We apparently ate the same, yet I had to work so hard to cover the crimson in my eyes so I didn't scare all the humans into running away screaming. You're still new, Bella. You're filled up with your own human blood. Alice smiled at me, as though delighted to give me this reassuring tidbit. Give it time. In a few months, the red will continue to fade, and then your eyes will be like ours, black when thirsty and this lighter brown when we've fed. She pulled on me again, and I let her lead me into the house. The men pointedly filed in behind us and closed off any avenues of escape. When we got inside, Rosie and another woman were waiting for us. I glanced at Alice in surprise, and then let her lead me over to the dark-haired woman who appeared to be waiting to meet me. Bella, this is our mother, Esme Cullen. Esme, this is Bella Swan. She's Charlie Swan's daughter. Alice made the introductions formally, politely, precisely. Esme looked delighted, reaching out to clasp my free hand and pressing it between hers. Jasper tugged Alice to his side in a gesture that was adorably protective. It looked like Edward was not the only one that thought I was going to go nuclear. Bella, it's so nice to meet you. The Cullen matriarch's smile was warm and inviting. She made me actually begin to believe Alice's assurances that they really weren't determined to destroy me. Thank you, Mrs. Cullen. I wasn't sure how to respond to her greeting. Renee would have a fit at not saying something about the house or how nice it was to meet them, but some part of me still wasn't sure they weren't going to tear me to shreds. I just couldn't bring myself to thank them for inviting me to my own death. With a tug on my hand, Esme drew me further away from Alice and led me into the huge living room to sit on the white leather sofa. My eyes widened at the elegance of the room. Everything was a study of shades of white. The entire house, all that I had seen, was elegant. It was just like the woman who settled onto the couch beside me. I noticed all this as I watched the rest of the family file into the room, taking up their spaces nearest their beloved. All of them did this, save Edward, who stood behind the couch, where Esme led me. It was as though he expected me to attack his mother at any moment. I was pretty sure that there were no blood ties between any of the Cullens, but he seemed just as protective of Esme as if she were his real mother. Alice settled on a love seat at the corner of the couch, dragging Jasper over to her. Though he refused to sit down, he moved to stand behind her, watching me carefully. Rosie dropped delicately beside Alice, Emmett settling on the arm of the love seat next to her. I glanced behind me, Edward was still hovering, and then back at Esme as she tugged on my hands to get my attention. Edward told me a bit about you on the phone. He called when you were all leaving the school, Esme explained with a smile. I am sorry that my husband was not here to greet you. He had an emergency at the hospital and couldn't leave just now. I shook my head at her apology, shifting back slightly to lean against the back of the sofa. I was not sure if I could really trust this open welcome I was receiving, and I was thoroughly confused about mention of their father being at the hospital. That seemed completely out of place. Maybe their father was human, though I couldn't imagine how a human would survive in a family of vampires. You didn't know that I was coming. You could hardly be expected to plan for me in that short of time. I tried to reassure her, but she just smiled at me and then tilted her head in Alice's direction meaningfully. Actually, Alice told me this morning that we were going to have a visitor this afternoon, but she didn't see the car accident. Carlisle was called away to do surgery unexpectedly. Esme informed me with a smile. I heard Edward shift in surprise and turned my head to see him shooting a glare toward Alice. No one seemed surprised when she smiled back at him with that satisfied look on her face again. Oh, sit down, Edward, Alice admonished him. She's not going to attack anyone. He hesitated a moment and then slid into the empty space on the couch beside me. I turned my attention back on Esme after darting a surprised look across the way at Alice. My attention was distracted for just a brief moment as a familiar series of lines made their way foremost in my mind as I felt Edward sit down beside me. Is it indeed so? If I lay here dead, wouldst thou miss any life in losing mine? And would the sun for thee more coldly shine? Because of grave damps falling round my head, I wondered if any of these people would spare a second thought if they decided my life had to be forfeit. I could feel a tingle where Edward's leg touched mine, and those words took on whole new meaning to me. Would his life be affected at all if I was gone from this world? Esme squeezed my hand, pulling my attention back to the here and now. She was smiling at me in that sweet, warm way that she had, and then she tapped the fingers of her free hand on the back of mine. Tell us all about you, Bella. It is quite unusual to see a newborn alone, let alone with the control that you seem to have. Esme squeezed my hand again in a way that was probably meant to be reassuring. Alice says you've never taken a human life. Of all of us, only my husband, Carlisle, can boast the same. I nodded my head, confirming what Alice had told them. She's right. I have never taken a human life. I tried to concentrate on Esme and not on the distracting warmth that was Edward beside me. I took a deep breath. I knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to know why I was a vampire. They wanted to know what happened to me. Who changed me? I glanced at Alice, who had told me earlier that she already knew. She smiled at me encouragingly, so I focused on my hands. One still claimed by Esme, and decided that I would tell them my story. These were the circumstances that changed my life forever and turned me into the inhuman creature that I was today. It was very difficult for me to recount the events of the night that changed my life. I'd never told anyone before. I took a deep breath, focused my eyes upward again on the sweet, kind face of Esme, and my tale began. I wasn't sure the best way to tell my tale. Much of what happened to me was difficult to even think about. I had to get through this without having an emotional breakdown. I could feel Edward behind me, silent, yet listening intently. After a moment, the words came on their own, and I became the conduit. I gathered my thoughts and began. Kano, Kurna, Dialect. The night that I was attacked, I was walking back home from the market. Renee could not be trusted to do the shopping or the cooking. She was at the best flighty. Before she remarried, I was the one who checked her car to be sure it had gas, balanced the checkbook, and made sure there was food in the cupboards. That particular night, Renee had some summer gathering for all the teachers the next day. She was supposed to bring a salad. She forgot to tell me. As usual, so since she and Phil had plans that night, there I was, having to make sure that we had the things she'd need for her party. I was walking beneath a streetlight that had gone out when something hit me in the stomach. I felt the shopping bag fall out of my arms and hit the pavement. My last thought was to worry that the things for Renee's salad would be ruined because I dropped them. Then everything went black. When I woke, my chest was throbbing with pain. I thought I might have a couple of broken ribs, and I could feel that I was lying on the ground. Opening my eyes, I tried to figure out what had happened. It was obvious that I wasn't in Phoenix anymore. As I carefully sat up, I thought it was still Arizona, but I couldn't see the lights of the city. I turned my head, trying to see where I was, and if I could identify any landmarks. Then I saw them. There was a blonde man and a red-haired woman, and they were watching me. The woman looked bored, the man looked pleased. As I tried to get to my feet, he walked over to crouch beside me. I slid along the ground a few inches to get away from him. It became obvious to me that I wasn't going anywhere very fast. It was quite difficult to move or breathe because of my broken ribs. He smiled. I was gasping for air, obviously in pain, and his response was a smile. Hello. I was hoping you'd wake up in time for the main course. Now it's time for you to get up and see if you can get away. Dinner time is so much more fun when my meal is trying to escape, he said to me. Though my human memories were fuzzy and unclear, the details of my last few minutes were not ones that I thought I could ever forget. I tried to quickly get to my feet, but it took me several slow seconds. All I could think was that I wanted to be away from him and his creepy companion more than he wanted me to run. I didn't really understand what he meant about meals and dinner time, though I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well for me. Pain filled my body and mind and impeded my ability to focus clearly on what was happening. When I finally got my feet under me, I tried to run, but I was a complete klutz and I stumbled a lot over the uneven ground. I fell a few times and skinned my hands, making them bloody and raw. The more I fell, the more he seemed amused by my futile attempts. Just when I thought I'd gotten far enough that they were going to let me get away, the man suddenly appeared right in front of me, laughing. Well, you got farther than I thought you would, considering how much you were falling down, he said as he walked toward me. I took several steps back, but he just kept getting closer and closer. I turned and ran in a different direction. It seemed that as soon as I turned, he was already there, in front of me, almost instantaneously. No matter what I did, where I went, I could not evade him. The last time, in the middle of my stride, I felt something hit my back hard enough to make something else pop. Perhaps another rib. I hit the ground with some force, landing on my right hand. I definitely heard a pop, that time as my wrist broke from the momentum of my fall. My cry of pain caused him to laugh again, and then he gestured at me to get up. Go on, he said. See if you can get away. I didn't think my chances were getting better. The harder I tried, the more injured I got. But I had to do something. I didn't have it in me to just lie there and let him kill me. So I got up and started running again, holding my broken wrist to my chest. Suddenly he was in front of me again. He pushed me brutally, though I noticed how little effort went into it on his part. It sent me to the ground, and I rolled down a small embankment. I hit the bottom wrong, and the same hand took the brunt of my weight. I felt the bone break through the skin this time, and the smell of my own blood flowing so freely made me dizzy and sick. I'd never been able to tolerate the smell of blood. While I'd been able to force away my nausea and dizziness to keep running, I couldn't do it any longer. The pain I felt overtook my need to escape. My frail human body had reached the limits of its endurance. I guess he decided that I wasn't going to be much sport anymore, and he jumped down to land beside me a moment later. I was hyper-aware of him as he walked up and grabbed my right arm, pulling it into the air, jerking me upward and dislocating my shoulder. His eyes fixated on the jagged injury where the bone had broken through the skin of my wrist. "I was going to play with you some more, but you smell delicious and we're in a hurry," he said to me, baring his teeth. They glistened with moisture, and I remember screaming from the pain of his hold on my arm. My thoughts were fading in and out through the pain. Some things I noticed with sharp understanding, others were covered in a haze. I felt fear, though it was tempered by a kind of fatalistic acceptance. I had done what I could, but things had progressed beyond my ability to change what was happening to me. That was when he bit me. I remember screaming loudly over and over, pulling at my arm to try and get it away from him. He didn't stop hurting me. He moved from his bite to suck on the blood flowing freely from the injury at my wrist. He seemed to enjoy the pain this caused, and delighted in placing another bite just to the side of where the bone poked out. The pain was searing. After that, his teeth left my skin only long enough to slice into other spots along my arm and neck, including a large bite just above the artery. My vision had started to blur when I could feel the woman finally approach. She didn't seem happy about his little game, though that could only have been my pain-filled mind seeing things. "Are you done playing yet? I want to get moving." She walked up beside him and looked down at me. My vision deteriorated even further as I looked up at her, and my hearing started to fade. I could barely feel it when he finally dropped my arm and stepped back. I fell to the ground with a puff of dirt and a soft thud. The impact of my body on the ground caused me to black out. I have no idea how long. I only know that I was blessed with the peace of oblivion for a time. Then the burning started. I was forced abruptly out of comforting nothingness. The burning grew from the places where he bit me, through my arm and neck, and into my chest. I remember trying my best not to make any noise because, if they were still nearby, I didn't want to give them any reason to inflict more pain. It was already growing past my ability to function. Time lost all meaning when the burning started. I was just trying to live through whatever was happening to me. It got unbearable and felt excruciating. The pain that I experienced was absolutely indescribable. I knew that I could not be dead. Death couldn't hold the pain that I was feeling. Then it was over. Just when I thought that I would be trapped in that burning hell for the rest of eternity, it left my extremities and then faded inward toward my heart. My heartbeat started to stutter even slower, skipping even more beats, one by one. Finally, my heart was still, the burning left, and I remained. My throat burned, though it was not remotely as bad as the fires of hell. I looked around, unsure what I would find. I thought perhaps I had finally died, but I saw desert around me. I was confused, and I turned around in circles, looking for my attacker and his red-headed companion. I almost expected to see them standing there, but I was alone. I got to my feet carefully, reaching for my broken wrist. I expected that I would have to hold it in place, but I was surprised to see that the skin wasn't broken any longer. As the burning faded from my body, it had taken the other injuries with it, leaving them whole and perfect. I felt no more pain. Other than the burning in my throat, I was fine. In fact, I was much more fine than I ever had been before. Everything was better, but different. I was different. Something wasn't right. I always stumbled and fell so much that I constantly experienced some sort of discomfort, some twinge to remind me that I had fallen in some way within recent memory. It was then that a pack of coyotes ventured a bit too close. I didn't know if they were curious or confident in their numbers, but they thought to make dinner out of me too. I am sure the smell of my blood saturating the ground beneath me was a draw. I know it made my throat burn with a terrible kind of thirst. A pair of them came over to inspect me, and I acted completely on instinct. I was in the air and on the first animal before I even knew what I was doing, and in the next instant, my teeth sank into its throat. I drained it dry. When I was done with the first, I went after the rest of the pack. I found and killed every last coyote in that pack, one by one. Their blood didn't seem very appetizing. It didn't feel as though it was what I wanted most at that point. All I could think about was the thick blood running down my throat, and it helped with the burn. The blood eased it just a little each time, as I drank. I finished off 4 coyotes by the time the last one dropped from my hands, but the burning in my throat still consumed me. I wanted the burning to stop, and I knew to do that. I needed to find more blood. Further into the desert, I heard another heartbeat, fainter, faster. A heartbeat meant blood, and that meant less burn, so I leapt after it. I wasn't aware at all at the time how much faster and more agilely I was moving. I only knew the burning thirst I felt. The animal I heard was a rabbit. I tore into it, though it was gone so fast it was hardly satisfying. Then I went after another and another. They were small, so it took so much more. Any animal I could find was a sacrifice to my thirst, until I managed to drink enough to dampen the terrible burn I felt. It might have been days or hours. I wasn't really conscious of how many animals I killed, though with my new memory, I could remember each one. By then, it didn't matter. When the horrible burning started to moderate, my head began to clear, and I could think again. I looked around, really trying to understand where I was. I noticed that I was nowhere near the area where I'd killed the pack of coyotes. I was currently on a hillock higher than most everything around. I could see for miles and miles and miles. My sight was aware of things at a distance that no one should be able to see. Then the sun started to rise. I caught sight of a reflective sparkling, and I turned my head quickly, noticing the way my skin shimmered. I lifted my hand up to the bright Arizona sun and turned it several times. Glancing around, I noticed that the sparkles were reflecting off me and onto everything else. I dropped my hand and looked down at the rest of me. All my bared skin reflected like the facets of a diamond. It hit me right then. Comprehension finally registered in my mind. I had been changed completely. I wasn't human anymore. My thoughts were scattered in a million different directions, much like the reflections from my skin. My mind was processing everything that I was experiencing at a rate that I had never before encountered. The foremost level of my mind focused on the concept that I could not consider myself human any longer. I looked behind me at the last animal that I had found, my eyes absorbing the sight of the corpse laying on the ground, drained and broken. I had siphoned the blood from the desert fox, consuming every drop. Was I a vampire now? My eyes strayed to the blood on my shirt, my hands. I had never been able to tolerate the sight or smell of blood before. Just a hunt of the smell and I would drop cold in a faint. Now, instead of being repulsed by it, I craved it, my mind fading from rationality and the need for more. My mind strayed away from that thought automatically, triggering my habit of using avoidance to deny this possible reality. If I didn't think about it, it wasn't real. My next thoughts were of my mother. She would be worried about me. She would call Charlie, and I was sure that would not go over well. The first thing Charlie would do is get on the phone with the Phoenix Police Department and insist on an all-out manhunt. I had to find out where I was, figure out how long I'd been gone, and get word to my mother that I was safe. It didn't occur to me that I would be a danger to her, that she might not be safe around me. In the distance, I could see the freeway. I knew that if I followed the line of that road, I'd find out just where I was. Decision made, I headed toward the freeway, breaking into a run. I noticed that I didn't stumble as I moved over the uncertain terrain easily. With a smile, I sped up, the ground flying under my feet, and I marveled that I was so fast. It really didn't take long to reach the freeway with this incredible, ground-eating stride. I followed the freeway from a distance, heading in the direction that I thought would lead toward home. Not long after I started running, I came across a little town along the freeway, and slowed down to work my way around it. I had no desire to be found covered in blood and sparkling like a diamond in the middle of nowhere. Some part of me understood completely that the only way I was going to make it was to hide what had happened to me. I couldn't reveal to anyone what I was now. No one, not even my mother, could know just how different I was now. I waited until dark before I made my way to the little gas station in town. One old man was at the register and a much younger man seemed to be restocking the shelves. When I reached the back of the little shop, it became very obvious to me that things were not going to be as easy as I thought they would. The smell of the two humans inside the shop was almost too sweet to resist. I had the ability to think, and I knew that I did not want to kill these two people. Foremost in my mind, I couldn't go back to my sweet, innocent mother with blood on my hands. Most particularly, I did not want to become like the thing that had killed me. I was determined that I was not going to be like the thing that ended my life. Not only that, but I didn't know exactly what had made me this inhuman being. Had it been the bites he had forced into my skin? If it had been, would my bite do the same to others? I was not going to inflict the worst experience of my life on someone else. No one deserved that. It took all the control I had, but I didn't attack anyone. I found a quiet, secluded spot to wait as people came and went, getting gas and snacks. People talked about their trips, where they were going, where they had been, and before long, I found what I waited for. A pair of college-age girls talking about coming from Phoenix and heading to San Diego, then Tijuana. I'd noticed the direction they'd come off the freeway and the direction they went when they left. I knew where I was going now, and before someone noticed me, I made my way out of town and then took off again. Things got immeasurably more difficult when I reached the outskirts of Phoenix. I was careful to stay out of sight when the sun would reveal my differences. On one of these forays into the outskirts of town, my reflection in the side mirror of a parked car revealed more problems than I originally calculated. My eyes were the brightest red I'd ever seen, as crimson as the most vibrant red poppies I'd ever seen in pictures. I couldn't hide this. What I was worried about most, however, was that I still thirsted for blood, and human blood smelled the sweetest of all. I'll admit I gorged on desert wildlife before I even got close to any of the towns. No matter what I did, the burning persisted. I saw my lack of indulgence as revenge on the one who'd killed me. I would not be like him. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I refused to capitulate to this all-consuming thirst. I thought I wouldn't stand out so much with clean clothes, and I was able to move around in the streets a little more easily at night. I practiced my restraint since I didn't want to get anywhere near Mom or Phil while I was still worried that I might attack someone. I would walk through the streets at night, my head down, hair covering my face. I worked solely on containing my desire to attack. It took several days before I thought I was ready for a larger test of my control. Renee and Phil were not going to be test subjects. No more than necessary. I found a small specialty shop that focused on gothic paraphernalia. Lingerie, leather, wigs, everything for your standard vampire wannabe. I thought I might not stand out so much here. They didn't know how far from reality they were. The monsters really did exist, but they didn't look anything like these people thought they did. I was hoping, however, that not only would they have what I needed, but they wouldn't think it too odd if they caught sight of my red eyes. Luckily for me, the shop was dark and mostly empty. The shadows didn't help my control, but it certainly made it easier to hide how different I must look. I made my way to the register and asked the clerk about the contacts I needed. I tried not to be so obviously startled as I spoke. Not even my voice sounded the same. They had them, and I was able to purchase several pair and make my way out of the shop without anything more than curious looks. I don't know if they noticed the fact that my eyes were red, but if they did, they didn't say a thing about it. I popped the contacts into my eyes after I left the store, and walked past another parked car and its tiny side mirrors to test my theory. I was delighted when I noticed that the black of the contacts combined with the red of my eyes made them look a muddy brown, not the best color, but I would be passable. The contacts were uncomfortable, obscuring my vision, but it was worth it for the chance to feel normal again. I needed to be able to return home and reassure my mother that I was safe, alive, at least in the ways she could see. As I thought, Renee was absolutely out of control, jumping on me as I walked in the door. I managed to fake a stumble into the wall and held my breath carefully. If I was going to fail in this little experiment, it couldn't be my mother that would suffer. My homecoming was worse than I thought it would be. Renee was ecstatic to see me, of course, and there were many uncomfortable phone calls to Charlie since he was also freaking out. I could not tell my mother that I had been kidnapped. She and Charlie would have insisted upon a police interview. They would want to hunt down the person who had taken me. I did not want to go through that. I was a terrible liar, and I could not guarantee that I would make it, though the interrogations that Charlie was sure to subject me to. I had been gone for nearly 2 weeks, a very long time for the responsible person that I had always been. Instead, I went for the selfish teenager angle. Phil, who was really darling and wonderful for my mother, had stolen her from me, and I didn't want to deal with him any longer. Though it took some dramatics on my part, my parents seemed to accept my story, and I was able to mostly step right back into my human life. The next few weeks were a distressing test of my determination. I tried to be the human my mother needed as much as I could. However, I had to run out into the desert a lot through the night to hunt. I also had to hide in the house from the sun so much that my mother started to freak out again. She didn't know that I had no choice. I sparkled like a Tiffany bracelet in the blinding Arizona sun. It became obvious I had only two choices left: disappear again or go live with Charlie. I hated Forks. I'd always hated Forks. As much as I hated it, the very things I always vocally snubbed about the tiny, insular little town of Forks, Washington, had become the things that would make it possible for me to live a more human life. I would be able to continue to interact with my parents and at least finish high school. It took me over a month to talk my mother into the transfer. I missed tons of school. I had to choke down what to me were extreme amounts of human food trying to convince my mother that I wasn't developing an eating disorder. I had to hack it up later, but she insisted on sitting there and watching me eat. Daikana karna dialek. As I neared the end of telling my story for the Cullens, I described the plans I'd made to move up to here, the reasons and the results. As I finished, I looked back up into Esme's face and was startled by the compassion and understanding I saw there. She believed me. Until I saw that, I had no idea how I felt. Now, I could put a name to it. I was relieved. Her expression gave me hope. If Esme and Alice believed me, then everyone else would have to go along. At least, I hoped so. I began to have some faith that I might live through this encounter after all. Very interesting, I heard someone say from the entry to the room. Startling me, I had been so absorbed in my tale that I hadn't noticed that someone else had entered the house. I'd been so hyper-aware of everything since the change that no one had been able to sneak up on me before now. I stiffened, ready for anything, as I turned to see who it was. A tall, blonde-haired man approached the couch where I sat with Esme and Edward. I quickly stood. My conscious mind translated the movement as a gesture of respect. My instincts told me that respect may be what I called it, but being prepared is what it was. Edward leapt to his feet beside me, putting a restraining hand on my arm. Emmett stiffened, and Jasper crouched down, ready to launch into action. I was surprised for a moment at their instant response to me rising to my feet. I fought my own urge to respond defensively, knowing it would only escalate their own responses in a way that definitely made me less safe. The new vampire made no gesture that he even noticed my behavior. He went right to Esme and leaned down to place a tender kiss on her lips. Either he didn't care if I attacked him, or he didn't see me as a threat. Surrounded he was by people who seemed ready to defend him. I didn't suppose that he was afraid of me. It is so very difficult to deny the thirst that I admit you are the first I have heard who has been able to do so on your own, he observed. And I cast a curious look at Esme, who was quick to make the introductions. Other than yourself, you mean? Esme corrected affectionately, and then introduced him. My husband, she soothed me with a smile, though I was pretty sure who it was, from the way he kissed her. Carlisle Cullen. Carlisle, this is Bella Swan. She's Chief Swan's daughter. Carlisle nodded politely at me, acknowledging the introduction. The fascination and curiosity on his face were most evident. He didn't bother to hide it. I was able to deny my thirst just as you did, though I made it a point to stay away from populated areas for quite some time. I didn't trust myself. However, you had reasons that I did not. A family to return to that needed you. He paused for just a moment. Your mother didn't suspect anything. I smiled as I settled back onto the couch, shaking Edward's rough grip off my arm. My mother very likely did suspect something, but my mother is not someone most people understand without meeting her. She is almost impossible to describe. It is possible that she did, but more likely she was just so glad that I was home and safe that she just ignored anything that didn't fit with what she wanted to believe. I finally admitted Riley, causing Alice to giggle. I cast a smile over at Alice and noticed that she wasn't listening as closely as the others appeared to be. She was pulling on Jasper's arm, trying to coax him from his focus on me. He looked worried, perplexed, and downright confused. At least, the sour look I'd noticed in school was gone. I can't, Edward said suddenly, catching the attention of everyone in the room. I turned to look at him questioningly. He was obviously answering a question that someone asked him, though I thought it might have been a silent question. I doubted I would ever get used to this mind reading. I can't read her mind, Edward repeated, his focus on Carlisle's. Alice has been hiding things from us. She's known about Bella for months. She showed me everything that happened as Bella described it. My first reaction was indignation, followed by anger. I wasn't sure I minded Alice having witnessed my ordeal, but it was absolutely something I did not want Edward to witness. I closed my eyes, taking slow, steady breaths, until I ruthlessly subdued the anger. They were trying to help me, and they couldn't help the repercussions of their gifts. Once I gained control of myself again, I focused on the other things that mattered. I was suddenly curious just how much Alice had seen. If she had seen it all, why was she the only one not surprised at my presence in town? Why wouldn't she have alerted her entire family that I was coming with more warning than just telling Esme this morning? All of this didn't add up quite right to me. Why was Alice hiding me, my arrival, from her family? My eyes shot to her, the question in my eyes. Instead, I caught sight of Jasper staring at me in amazement. He dropped to sit on the arm of the couch beside Alice. She was smiling in a distant, vague sort of way. I looked back at Jasper and he shook his head at me, a slow movement that was a gesture of his mood more than a response to anyone, or so I thought. "I've never seen anything like her," he finally said in response to my growing bewilderment. His words were directed at the room at large, and then he focused on me again. "Extraordinary. I have never seen a newborn have such control over her emotions. Your emotions swung around so quickly, but then you reclaimed control." I groaned, dropping my head into my hands. Edward and Alice weren't the only ones who were gifted. I realized Jasper seemed to be able to access my emotions in an uncannily accurate manner. Was there anything private and secret anymore? "Okay, no more surprises for Bella," I said beneath the cover of my hands. "Are there any other gifts rolling around the room that are going to totally embarrass me when I find out about them?" Edward dropped down beside again with a sudden bark of laughter. Emmett nearly fell off the arm of the couch. He was laughing so hard. I looked up and glared at all of them, but there was no real heat in it. So glad I could provide the comic relief, it slipped out of my mouth as I lifted my head before I could censor my thoughts. Jasper immediately started laughing in response, and I sighed. "Don't worry about them. It means they like you." Carlisle was trying to reassure me from his perch on the arm of the couch nearest Esme. He was smiling with amusement at their antics. "Don't take them too seriously."
"Lola, I know that you are very confused."
"There are many things in which we can offer assistance." Esme's voice filled my ears and my attention returned to her. "My mother did teach me manners, and I wouldn't show the Cullen matriarch any disrespect in her own home. In fact, I know, for all of us, we see it as our duty to take you under our wing. There are things that you need to know about living as a vampire, and it will be much easier to have the support of people who understand." Esme's tone was perfect. Maternal, soothing. I felt mothered in a way that had never worked for Renee and me. I was more apparent in that relationship. I savored the feeling that someone cared enough to take care of me. I didn't know how to respond to her verbally, though, so I just smiled. I didn't want to be a duty, but there was no denying that I was completely clueless. I also knew that they weren't really giving me a choice. After a moment, I just nodded. If they were as friendly as they seemed, and if they fought and succeeded in living with humans without hurting anyone, they knew things that I did need to learn. It would be best as much as possible for you to be here where we can talk and teach you things that you need to know. I know that you need to be there for your father," Esme continued along as though my agreement was only minor and they were going to take care of me whether I wanted it or not, "but there is no need to test your control more than is necessary." "One of us should stay with her for a while," Alice suggested with a smile that was far too innocent. "To explain things to her and just make sure she stays out of trouble. I suggest Edward." Edward twitched in surprise, and I must have been gaping at her, but no one else questioned her suggestion. I wondered how she'd hidden this from him. It must be hard to surprise a man who can read your mind. "Good idea," Esme confirmed, turning to smile at me. "He will be nearby but out of sight when your dad is home and stay with you as much as possible at school. Everyone is going to think they're dating," Alice giggled, her eyes twinkling with amusement and delight. The look she gave Edward was positively wicked. I couldn't look at Edward. I didn't want to look at Edward. I didn't want to see the look on his face while he thought about the best way to say that he didn't want to spend that much time with me. Even that little, not-so-personal rejection was more than I wanted to deal with right then. My head dropped so that I could inspect my hands clenched in my lap. My hair slid forward to hide my face again. If I'd still been human, I'd have blushed so red that it would have looked like I had a serious high-temperature fever. I gave a little shake of my head. "That's not really fair to Edward," I asserted once I'd found my voice again. "I'm positive that he has better things to do with his time than keep me out of trouble," I insisted. I wasn't sure what Alice was up to, but I was very sure that I didn't want Edward shadowing me. I felt off balance when he was around, and it wasn't something that I was comfortable with or used to. Besides, he had to have interests that were far more important than tailing me. "Oh, don't be silly, Bella," Alice insisted in her melodic voice. "It would look terribly suspicious if Emmett or Jasper started following you around. Everyone already knows they're taken. Edward's the only one not involved." "It's fine," Edward finally spoke up. Amusement tinged his voice. "I don't mind at all. As Alice said, someone needs to hang around, and I can explain things to you. I've been around long enough that I think I can cover most things." I blinked in surprise at that, and then had to smile as I finally turned to look at him, pushing my hair out of the way. He looked the youngest, seemed to have been turned at the younger age. It made me wonder about his age in relation to the others. "So you're an old man, then?" I couldn't help teasing him, even though some part of me was still expecting them all to rip me apart. "Old enough to be your great-grandfather, Bella." He almost smiled at me. At least I think he did, but his answer was sober and serious. I got the idea that he didn't want to be teased about his age, and instead I turned back to smile at Esme. I was grateful. It had been hard to do this on my own, and I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Thank you. I've been coping the best way that I knew how. So long as they weren't going to kill me, I could do gracious. I do need to get going, though. I have to go to the grocery store before Charlie gets home. The man is a menace in the kitchen. It's truly frightening to see." My vampire senses kept track of the time without the benefit of a clock, and I had a feeling that I was nearing the point of my tolerance tonight. I got to my feet to indicate that I was completely serious about leaving, though part of me expected them to stop me, no matter what Esme had said. Instead, Edward got to his feet with me and took my arm, this time in a gesture that seemed more gentlemanly than restraining. As we left the small sitting area where everyone gathered, his hand moved to the small of my back, and he guided me gently to the door. I tried to hide my surprise. This didn't seem like the same man that had insisted I was too dangerous to go to gym earlier. "Are you up for a trip to the grocery store?" he asked me softly as we said our goodbyes, and as he led me out the door. He moved gracefully down the front stairs, and showed me right to my truck, in a gesture that was almost courtly. "I have done it before, successfully, if that helps," I offered. He still didn't trust my control, and from the way they reacted, he probably had reason to doubt me. I wasn't sure what other newborn vampires acted like, but from the way the Cullens reacted to me, I was sure that I didn't do the things they expected. It would figure that I was a complete anomaly. He shook his head as he opened the passenger side door and stood back to allow me to climb into my truck. I shot him an inquiring look. He just gazed back innocently, and I sighed, climbing up into the passenger seat. I didn't know him very well, but it seemed that until he could trust that I wasn't going to lose it, he was going to be terribly bossy with me. "I know it doesn't seem like it," I grumbled softly as he climbed in on the other side and held his hand out for my keys. "But I am a big girl. I've been taking care of myself just fine for a while now." This seemed to amuse him, and he shot me a crooked smile. Involuntary functions were no longer a part of my physical makeup, but my lungs didn't seem to understand that as I sucked in a sudden breath at the sight of that smile. He was breathtaking. Gone was the cold, borderline violent boy that frightened me. In that one gesture, he seemed like an entirely different person. Edward's topaz eyes met mine, and my breath caught. There was something about him that made me feel a little out of control. As hard as it was for me to have him so close, perhaps they all had a point. Maybe I did need a babysitter. But this Edward that smiled at me and led rather than restrained, I didn't mind so terribly much. Edward took me to the grocery store and hovered closely while I attempted to bolster the meager offerings of Charlie's kitchen. I was surprised by the number of curious looks we were receiving. I really did hate being the focus of attention, but for the most part, having Edward following me around wasn't as painful as I expected. Today I was shopping. My main objective at the store was obtaining fresh fruits and vegetables. Charlie's kitchen didn't offer much in the way of fresh items. His fridge was nearly entirely bare, stocked only in things that went well with pan-grilled fish. He had several lemons. It was really disturbing just how much fish Charlie ate, broken only by the dubious nutrition of pizza. Charlie loved that pizza was delivered right to his door without his having to even enter the kitchen. Still, I never understood his love for fish, even when it was something that was edible. I know I was supposed to be putting on a show. It was acceptable, possibly even desirable, if the town started to think there was a budding romance. I had always been a terrible liar, though I'd gotten better at it in the last few months. It just didn't seem believable that the breathtaking Edward Cullen was smitten with me. I didn't even try to put any effort into convincing onlookers that we were suddenly attached to each other. I didn't flirt, but was polite to him. I answered his questions about food and tried not to be downright rude, but that was all I could ask of myself for now. It didn't take long, even at a human pace, to gather together what I needed. Most of the basics went a long way if you were careful about what you got and how you used them. It was just Charlie and I certainly wasn't going to be forcing a whole lot of anything down my throat. I know Edward watched me the entire time, but I saw more suspicion than curiosity in his gaze. He would tense at odd times, and I noticed they corresponded with the close proximity of humans. He was silent about these moments, however, and never once grabbed me. When arrived at Charlie's, Edward helped me unload the groceries from the truck. As we put everything down on the kitchen table, I knew my time was limited. I was going to have to move pretty quickly to get everything done before Charlie got home. I gave up the human pretense and zipped around the kitchen at vampire speed while putting away the groceries and gathering together everything for Charlie's dinner. While I worked, Edward dropped into Charlie's favorite chair at the battered old kitchen table, watching while I started to throw things onto the stove. Lasagna, one of Charlie's favorites, wasn't too difficult to make. It took time to prepare the separate parts, since you had to boil the noodles before you could do anything else, so I did as much as I could as quickly as possible. It was also something different from Charlie's usual diet of grilled fish and pizza, while still using up some of the endless supply of fish. I had been darting about the room for several minutes before he did anything other than watch me. Edward cleared his throat and I turned curiously. From the look on his face, he had been trying to get my attention for several moments. "You really are something," he said, a perplexed look on his face. I figured some of that had to do with the fact that my mind wasn't open to him like everyone else's. I loved that he didn't have access to my thoughts. My brain was muddled when he was around, and I didn't want him to be aware of the confusion that his presence brought out in me. "Am I?" I turned back to the stove again, checking the fillet of trout that I had frying in the pan for the lasagna. After I'd browned both sides, I chopped it up into pieces with the spatula while I waited for him to answer my question. "For one thing, your control was absolutely extraordinary. You had to be in extreme pain." Edward continued, "You didn't even lean toward any of the humans when we were in the grocery store." I shrugged. It was something I couldn't deny. It was hell. There were no pretty words for it. I savored this fact. He knew he had experienced the same thing that I experienced. It was delightful. It helped, and I didn't feel so alone in the world any longer. "Would you do me a favor?" he asked softly, and I knew he was still looking at me, though it must have seemed that I was ignoring him. On the contrary, I was too aware of him. I had been ignoring the awareness that his full attention had been completely focused on me. I knew that I couldn't really be that interesting to him, and it wasn't likely to last. He had surprised me with his request, however. I glanced behind me as I dropped the now cooked fish into a bowl with some marinara sauce. I guess that depends on what it is. I didn't know him well enough to grant an open favor without knowing what it was. "I find it quite—" He paused, and I watched him curiously, my hands working on creating the cheese layer of the meal in a big bowl without the need much of my attention. "Difficult that I do not know what you are thinking. Right now, especially. Would you mind enlightening me?" That didn't really surprise me. It must drive him crazy. I just wasn't sure how to answer him. He was doing me a favor, looking after me like this, and while I didn't like requiring a babysitter, I did appreciate it. I delayed my answer by retrieving the baking dish I needed to bake the lasagna and started to spoon out some of the fish mixture on the bottom. My awareness returned to the book of poems that was so much in my thoughts of late. The Elizabeth Browning's words had been so much on my mind lately, resonating in my soul. As I looked at Edward, a particular passage came to me. "If thou must love me, let it be. For naught, except for love's sake, only. For these things in themselves, beloved, may be changed or change for thee. And love, so wrought, may be unwrought. So, what I'm thinking right now," I confirmed, dragging my thoughts away from such maudlin things. I wasn't about to volunteer the entirety of what was going on in my mind. Too much was centered on how strange I felt around him. He only nodded in answer, knowing that I would feel the gesture even if I wasn't looking right at him. I took a deep breath and let it out in a long, soft sigh. I delayed answering again while I layered in the hot noodles directly from the pot with my bare fingers. My stone-like skin registered the heat of the boiling pasta, but it didn't feel like pain, so I didn't take much notice of it at all. My attention was focused on the man behind me. I wished I weren't so completely aware of him. I'm trying to adjust to everything that's happened in the last few months. Still, right now, a part of me is absorbing how the house smells. I noticed that it's easier to resist when I'm used to the scent. I covered the pan with foil and put it into the preheated oven. That part done, I could show him how I coped with living with a human. I walked to where I'd placed my backpack when we walked into the house, picked it up, and walked back into the kitchen. I lifted the bag onto the table and rustled around inside it, looking for something very specific. As I drew out the small object, I held it out to Edward quietly. It was a beat-up old fishhook with a brightly colored plastic lure still attached. He looked at it blankly, and then his expression grew more confused. "Charlie's?" he asked, tilting his head in question. "It smells like he's pricked his finger on this a few times. It has residues of his blood." I nodded and then sat down on the other chair as I took the lure back, careful not to touch his fingers as I did so. "It's easier to resist if I keep the scent of him close. It's like I become acclimated to it," I explained, since he looked quite worried. The worried look left his face and it turned back to curiosity. "Really?" He looked back up from the lure in my hands, and his eyes met mine. I was grateful again that I could no longer blush. It felt like another moment I should be blushing. In fact, those moments happened every time his eyes met mine. I looked away quickly. "Yes, actually, you've not noticed that." From what he said, I figured he was old enough to have experienced this thoroughly. Compared to me, he was the epitome of the experienced vampire. "We have never spent time with specific humans," Edward explained, tilting his head as though he was irritated that I kept looking away and he wanted to see into my eyes again. If he was annoyed by the fact that I avoided his eyes, he was going to have to get used to the idea. My mother often said that my eyes were an open book into Bella's thoughts. Considering I loved the idea he couldn't read my mind, I had no desire to make reading me any easier for him. "You've never been around singular humans enough to get used to their scents," I confirmed curiously as I glanced at the clock above the table in habit. "No," Edward confirmed, smiling at me just slightly. It was getting pretty close to the time that my father would be home, and I wanted to make sure that everything was ready before he walked into the house. It reminded me that I could see again clearly, which meant that I'd have to put in a new pair of contacts before Charlie got home. "Bella," Edward's tone was reproachful as it broke through my internal wrangling. My attention focused back on him, my eyes meeting his. "Why are you acting like you're afraid I'm going to attack you? You have given me no reason to hurt you. Your nervousness seems excessive for Charlie's arrival," he said, his eyes showing concern. Freaking perceptive vampire. Apparently, I was disgustingly easy to read, even when he couldn't see into my head. There were two reasons I was jumpy, and I wasn't about to share the one that was starting to become a bigger part of the truth than I wanted to admit. Edward Cullen was the most attractive man I had ever met in my life. I didn't want him babysitting me. I wanted him to want to spend time with me. A growing part of me wanted the romance to be real. I wanted him to find something interesting in me, something that made him want to spend time with me. While I thought that being the only exception to his mind reading did draw his interest, I didn't want that to be the only reason. I cleared my throat, unsure if I could get him to believe the whopper that had been perfectly true earlier in the day, but was becoming less so with every moment in his company. I was a horrible liar, and I couldn't look at him while I evaded the complete truth. It would be far too obvious that I was lying if he could see my face. I busied myself with hunting around in my backpack for a pair of contacts, giving me an excuse not to look at him. I had several pair I kept in there to make sure I always had some with me. "The last vampires I met attacked and killed me," I said quietly. "I think it might just take time to get used to the idea that your family isn't as violent." I glanced up quickly from my backpack to see how he received that information, but he was looking quietly out the window over the sink. There was no revealing expression on his face that gave me a clue about what he was thinking. After a moment, he turned to look at me again, and he nodded. "All right," he admitted as his topaz eyes met mine again. "I guess time will bring trust to both of us. I'll be behind the house in the woods while your father's awake. When he goes to sleep, I'll go hunting with you, and we can talk about some of the things that you need to know. You seem to be okay with your father for the short time that you're alone together. Don't hesitate to ask for help if you need it. I'll hear you." I could hear the distinctive knock in the engine of Charlie's patrol car as it came down the street. I nodded, agreeing to Edward's suggestion as I grabbed the contact case and popped in the dark lenses that made my eyes brown again. Edward gave me an encouraging smile and slipped out the back door and disappeared into the woods. I glanced at my reflection in the microwave and wished for my simple, normal brown again. The dark brown that the contacts made my eyes was certainly more attractive than brilliant red, but they weren't what I was used to seeing on myself. I wondered if Edward would have liked the soft brown that had been my original eye color. But I couldn't change them back now. It was useless to wish, so as usual, I tried to forget about it and just went in with the things I could accomplish. I could hear Edward settle into the branches of a tree not far from the backyard and smiled. Not only did he make a point of moving loudly enough that I could hear him, but he really was staying pretty close. I thought it was to protect Charlie if it was needed, though I knew he wouldn't be fast enough if I lost it. I contemplated Edward's painful seriousness. Was it because of his age, or was it just part of his personality? I guess since he was going to be hanging out with me a lot, I might just find out the answer to that. I cleaned my backpack off the table, making sure to hide Charlie's lure again so that I would have it with me tomorrow at school. That done, I set the table, returning to human speed so Charlie wouldn't see anything unusual. As the patrol cruiser pulled into the driveway, I was throwing together a simple salad before I went over to check the lasagna. I realized after my first night here that the evening ritual of eating dinner together was going to be a big thing for my father. I thought it was not only because of my disappearance this summer, but also because we'd never really spent any real portion of my life together. We'd never lived in the same house, not since I was really young. It was very important to me to give these things to him while I could. If the Cullens were any indication, I was only going to really be able to be involved in my parents' lives like this for only a few years longer before I was going to have to disappear completely. They would start noticing that I didn't change and that I still looked like I did from the time I was 17. Changing my hairstyle and clothes would only hide my unchanging face for so long. I tried not to think about how much the idea hurt as I stood up to check on the lasagna. Thankfully, it didn't take long to cook since everything was already done before it went in the oven. It was just blending the flavors together. My father came into the house and joined me in the kitchen as I was taking the pan out of the oven and placing it on the table. I barely remembered oven mitts. That would have been hard to explain. "Hey, Bells," he greeted, as he hung up his jacket and gun and his eyes hit the table. A smile of satisfaction spread across his features. He really liked having dinner ready as he came home. I took a small breath and let myself feel the burn of his scent while I set out 2 servings. Mine was as small as I thought I could get away with. By the time I looked up at him, I was able to smile and greet my father. "Hey, Dad. How was work?" "Pretty slow," he admitted with a smile, and I had to admit, at the police station, slow was a good thing. Pete and I played cards most of the day. It made me laugh as I sat down and piled some salad onto his plate. "How much did you make off him?" Charlie and the boys often gambled pennies when they played cards. "Couple dollars," he admitted with a smile as he sat down across from me and immediately tackled the lasagna. "Oh, wow, Belle, I didn't think you could make good lasagna with fish." It made me laugh again. "Dad, I have to find something to do with all that fish you bring home. Lasagna will have to be the least of my creative endeavors." I could hear Edward moving around in his perch in the tree. He must have wanted me to know that he was still there. He really seemed worried that I'd attack my dad. Charlie looked concerned at the thought of creative cooking. "Dad," I said in my most reassuring tone, "I'm not Mom. You won't find me mixing impossible things together." He shrugged and then gave me a little smile. I'd have thought that fish lasagna sounded strange, but it's really pretty good. "Thanks for cooking, Bells." His simple appreciation felt good. I felt a wave of gratitude. My father was a good person, and I was lucky to have him. "It's not a problem, Dad. I don't mind cooking. I wasn't lying. I didn't mind at all."